Is everyone in? Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Churchill, professor of English at Davidson College, and I'm so delighted to see so many familiar, beloved names in the participants list here. And for those of you who I don't know, at least by the end of this evening, we will have something in common, which is a deeper appreciation of the poetry of Louise Glick. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Alumni and Family Engagement, Davidson Arts and Creative Engagement, the Department of English, and the E.H. Little Library. Tonight's lecturer will be Professor Alan Michael Parker, the poet, novelist, and critic. He's the author or editor of 18 books, including most recently, The Age of Discovery, his 9th collection of poems. If you don't have it, you're going to want to get your hands on it. He was a book critic for The New Yorker for 9 years and has edited numerous volumes on poetics, including serving as the editor for North America Who's Who in 20th Century World Poetry. His various awards and honors include 2 selections in Best American Poetry, 3 Pushcart Prizes, the North Carolina Book Award, and the Medwick Award for the Poetry Society of America. He holds degrees from Washington University and Columbia University, where his teachers included 3 Nobel laureates, Joseph Brodsky, Seamus Heaney, and Derek Walcott. Houchin's professor of English, he has taught at Davidson since 1998. And in his website, you can find his website if you want to find out more about him or his books at alanmichaelparker.com. Could one of the co-hosts put that in the chat to everyone? We are planning on leaving a lot of time at the end of the lecture for questions and answers. So toward the end of the program, and we'll give you the cue, so please wait, we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat. And please, you have a choice of choosing a co-host or host that you can send your questions to. Please direct them to me, Suzanne Churchill. I'll be moderating the Q&A and we'll remind you of my name at the end. Also, right now, if you haven't done it already, please mute your volume. That would be great. And also, just to let you know, we'll be recording this session and posting it onto YouTube. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Alan Michael Parker.
Thank you, Dr. Churchill. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It is amazing to see all these faces and names and people from other generations of Davidson life. College continues. Tomorrow is our last day of classes before we break and send students safely home, we hope, as well as to safety at home. It's been quite a remarkable semester, and I hope you have. I hope all of you have stayed healthy and well and safe. Putting together this lecture has been really thrilling. I've read the work of Louise Glick for many years, have seen her read, have hosted her here at Davidson. She came and visited and read and talked to students, taught for a 2-day residency. And then she wins the Nobel Prize. And that lets us talk about her as the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize in poetry. And to consider the work more deeply. I'm going to range in my talk. I'm going to try to feature her work as much as possible. And that's in fact where we're going to begin, which is with Louise Glick reading. And she's going to be, this is a reading of hers, of her doing the, let's see if I can get there. This is Louise Glick, The Wild Iris, which is the title poem from her 1992 Pulitzer Prize winning volume. Apparently I need to put a password. Can you tell me, can you wave at me if you hear this, Bonnie?
At the end of my suffering, Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. Overhead noises, branches of the pine shifting. Then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Then it was over. That which you fear, being a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. You who do not remember passage from the other world, I tell you, I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue shadows on azure seawater.
And so here we go. I'm going to return to this poem later. I will screen the same clip that we just saw, and I will also put the text up on the screen and talk through the poem. It's one of the two poems I'm going to give pay more attention to this evening. But first, I thought I'd start with her bio, give some sense of who she is. She was born in 1943 on Long Island. She is a second-generation immigrant, Hungarian Jewish lineage. Her father and brother-in-law, her father and uncle, father and his brother-in-law, together invented the X-Acto knife. So marvelous little American consumer trivia for you. Glick had a relatively troubled childhood. There was a younger sister who died at birth before Glick was born. Her mother was quite traumatized, understandably, by the loss of a child. And Glick herself was severely anorexic, a disease, a condition that she has talked about in essays, so I'm not outing her, nor am I spilling secrets, nor will I say that this accounts for work. I don't do a biographical reading, but what it does account for is that she is relatively self-schooled. She had to withdraw from high school and then also underwent 7 years, starting as a teenager, of significant psychoanalysis. And that psychoanalytic work remains part, I would argue, what she learned in psychoanalysis was how to question the self. And I think that's deep in her corpus. It's deep in the poems that we're going to talk about tonight. She went to Sarah Lawrence and then also attended Columbia. At times had to attend basically as a correspondence, in part because of her illness. She studied most prominently with Leone Adams and then with Stanley Kunitz, this remarkable Stanley Kunitz, who was poet laureate himself for a while, founder of Poets House in New York, and a significant teacher in the history of American poetry, responsible for a number of, I would say, remarkable lessons in the lives of really important American poets. She herself has taught. As she says, she fell into teaching, which for her was 20 years at Williams, and then she was lured away by Yale. She has taught at Columbia, and she is still teaching. She has won pretty much every major award available to American poets, which range from the National Book Award, the Bowlingin, the National Humanities Medal, which President Obama bestowed upon her in 2016, and the Pulitzer Prize, of course, in 1992, and then this year, the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize Committee praised her, and I'm quoting, for her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal. And not a bad description. Way to go, Nobel. We're going to return also to some of these ideas and try to talk through that, the austerity, pardon me, as well as some of the beauty in the work. and see if we can find it in the poems. She shares one tragic and remarkable fact with a previous American woman who won the Nobel Prize, and that is Toni Morrison, in that both of them had their houses burned down and lost significant portions of their work. Both of them lost work in fires to their homes. A sad and I think kind of strange coincidence. It is not, however, the biography that interests me as much as it does the poems themselves, or as poetry in general. And as is my custom, current students of mine know this, since as to perhaps Dr. Churchill knows this. My understanding of poetry is that it asks of us to know ourselves. And so as a result, I am going to use the marvelous feature in Zoom to ask you to vote. I have 2 polls lined up, and here they come, and they'll pop up on your screen, and please do vote. And so here is the first. And here are your results. What I do with these results, what I do in my classroom, and what I guess ask of you also this evening, is to understand that as you make a decision to choose between these options, that you are making a decision based on also what you look for when you read a poem, and what you're going to look for tonight, what it is that you want, what your own education, Davidson or otherwise, has taught you to understand about poetry and its place in your life, but also as your reading and the way that you might approach a text. And I find that pretty fascinating. I think we have a kind of even vote here between Tingle and Change Me, not that they're mutually exclusive. And then I'm going to share another, there's one. I guess I should screenshot this before it goes away, because the polls do disappear. So now I have a record of your inner lives, which is of course my whole goal. And then I will do another poll. And this is one that's going to lead us into our first discussion of the first poem of hers. And here we go. Oh, and to Dr. Churchill, I should tell you, I'm already off my agenda. I'm already out of order of the list of things I was going to do in whatever order. It's already happening. You share with Louise Glick what I would presume to be her assumption. And this is a very presumptuous move on my part. Certainly critics aren't allowed to do this, but I think she thinks of poems a telephone. And I want to talk a little bit about the way in which she is calling herself, and she is also calling us, and what those calls might look like in the forms of her language, in her decision-making on the page, in her relationship to ideas, and as well as her relationship to the history of American poetics, to art making in general. I should say, I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, I should screenshot this one. Sorry, because I want to know again. Here we go. Now I can stop sharing. I should say before we move further that that Glick's her bibliography is extensive and marvelous, widely available, including a number of books. This is the spectacular Poems 62 to 2012, which I highly recommend. I'll be talking a little bit about this collection as later on, but it also her first book, which I will show you here. Let's see if I can screen share this. The poll should not still be up. Is that poll still up? No? Okay. Her first book, which is a book called Firstborn, quite amazingly, here is our library's edition of it, and it is signed and in the archives, the first edition of the Firstborn, Poems by Louise Glick. When you are next on campus, you can make an appointment and perhaps take a peek. So it's great that the library's got this. We have a couple of other editions of hers, including in our collections a limited edition of one of her of a poetry pamphlet, they call them in the UK. Here they're called chapbooks, a signed chapbook of hers as well. So I think what I'll do next is talk a little bit about what to expect from a Louise Glick poem. And here's what I think. Maybe I'll talk about what I think is easy about the work. And this is a precursor again to going back to thinking about The Wild Iris, which is the first poem we're going to look at. So a Louise Glick poem appears in simple language. That's very much a tradition coming to us from the Romantics, from Wordsworth, through the filtered through, I would say, Emily Dickinson, who's a prominent poet in Glick's pantheon, but also then through free verse especially. She is a free verse poet. She pays a lot of attention to form and to line, but she is writing in, she's not writing in received metrical forms. She loves the lyric nonetheless, and the lyric is that poem that's in the history of the oral tradition, sung by the poet speaker, I should say. The lyric takes place out of time. It never occupies, there might be actions that happen, but those actions are literally out of time. Time does not pass in a lyric poem. Her poems are infused with classical learning. There's a ton of classical mythology in Glick's poems. She writes often in the voices of classical figures, and especially in the voices of, we have poems, and Persephone is a much beloved figure of hers, but there are others as well. Demeter, she thinks Telemachus is someone who's featured in the work, and she thinks a lot about the ways in which the Greek mythology, filtered through contemporary experience, still talks to us about who we are. Her poems are intimate, and her poems are personal. And I put that idea of personal in the description of tonight's talk, because I am going to make a distinction between the personal and the autobiographical, and which in American poetics is also a distinction between the personal and the confessional. She writes about herself, but the self is a speaking actor in the poems. She uses names, her ex-husband's name, her dog's name, her son's name, they appear, but she's not outing them in terms of their what they have done to her or each other in their lives. She uses the forms of the family drama, of the family romance, to borrow Freud's term, to talk about existence. And in this way, she's not Plath. She's not someone whose autobiography is the material of the work. The autobiography is the mechanism of the work. And that distinguishes her as personal rather than confessional. It's a key distinction. What's difficult with a Glick poem is that she loves metaphor, she loves surprise, and she's a very deep thinker. And so the poems on the surface have this kind of easy diction. She's using words that we can understand. But as soon as you start scrutinizing the poem, you realize, okay, wait a minute, there are hard ideas here. And I have to say, I greatly admire her for this. There's never a Glick poem that's easy under its surface. She never gives up a single reading, a single thematic idea. There's always ambiguity, there's always the multiplicity, there's always of metaphor, there's always voices, there are always voices. And then what's also challenging is that she's fascinated by liminal spaces, by the space between dreams and reality, the space between reality, thought and speech. And you don't always know who you are or where you are in a Glick poem. So there are movements. We see this in the Wild Iris, and we'll see this again in the second poem that I discuss. There are moments in the poem where you thought you were in a quote unquote real place, and then you're in a dream, or then a voice is coming to you from another place. And that shifting of the ground, and I mean that literally as a painter would, is sometimes difficult to track. So that could be hard when you're reading her for the first time. Her subjects, clearly the classics, Persephone again, Achilles, mostly female characters. Mostly her feminism is embodied in the voices of various female characters from myth. And then there is a significant, I would say sometimes even overwhelming, affection for, obsession with Dante. Dante is all over her work. And in fact, we're going to look at a couple of moments where Dante is explicitly in the work. She thinks very hard about the underworld, the natural world. She locates her own interests somewhere between the underworld and the natural world. People are moving back and forth between those states of existence, and they're doing so. Sometimes they're doing so to talk to us. Sometimes they're doing so to listen to us. And she has written a number of books that specifically engage Dante, and especially I'm thinking of Avernus, and we're going to look at a poem from Avernus later. Avernus is the volume that came out after 9/11, and she thinks of it as her 9/11 book, talks about it that way. But then she's Jewish, and so her way of working with classical learning includes what is to me explicitly in the Midrash tradition of dialogue, of characters offering commentary on a text and questions about a text as a way to further our understanding of that text. That learning happens in dialogue with a primary source. So she's always asking of original sources as well as of herself and her own motives. There's always this back and forth. There's the Midrash tradition of saying, well, what do you mean here? What do you mean? What do I mean here? And those voices are not necessarily real voices, but they are profound voices in her poetic. In terms of other poetry, just to give you a little bit of historical context, she is a deep reader as well. Dickinson figures as a major influence, but then there's also Lorca, Rilke, also a lot of Rilke in her work. And then among contemporaries, Frank Bedart would be, is dear to her, he and his work. They have a 60-year friendship. And then maybe the next generation of poets, Carl Phillips, Henri Cole. And again, these are poets who aren't necessarily autobiographical, not necessarily confessional, but are personal poets, at least among the Americans. So let us return and talk for the first time about one of the poems. And this is, again, The Wild Iris. And then I'll share the text and we will do a little, and I'll talk through it a little bit. Did I not share that? That was bad. Okay, someone can holler at me. I was one click away from getting it right. Okay. Dr. Churchill, shall I return? Would you like to see her read that again? Shall I do it again? What is your preference? Shall I move on?
Up to you, Ellen Michael, but please call me Suzanne.
Okay, I shall, Suzanne, as always. I think of Dr. Churchill as my nickname for you. I think that, I know. All right, so let's go to the text. And here it is. And I will do it this way and share it this way. And we can talk this way. So, all right. Here we go. And this one I'll remember to share. My bad. So sorry about that. View full screen. There we go. And share screen. Yes, do we see this?
Not sharing.
Not sharing. Okay, how about now?
We can see it.
Awesome, sorry about that snafu. Okay, here we go. So, The Wild Iris was written over is the title poem, the first poem of a book-length series, written in about 10 weeks, spring to summer, in documenting the life in a New England garden. It is a series about the gardener, but also a series that reimagines the voice of a prophet from the Old Testament. And sometimes those voices are doubled. Sometimes they're both speaking. Sometimes the flowers themselves speak quite a bit. Glick uses moments of formal moments of prayer. There are 7 matins, poems that are titled matins, and 10 vespers in the volume. And the volume tracks in some ways a return to creation, to the notion of the artistic life, from a period of fairly deep existential anxiety, as well as depression. So it's a book very much about renewal and about a garden being the object of that renewal. She talks about this book in interviews and she goes through long periods of not writing, which is fascinating for us, because she will, unlike other poets, admit to the long periods and talk through what she does and how she copes. And for her, this book comes out of Mozart and begonias, that she read deeply about begonias and was obsessed with Mozart. It took 2 years, and then the wild iris showed up. So in the wild iris, hold on, I am almost there. Where is that note? Excuse me. Gone. Okay, so in the wild iris, she's thinking hard about what constitutes what constitutes renewal, and where we go when we are not deep in our own maybe true selves, but what the various states of being might be. There are a couple of key phrases in this poem. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. And then hear me out is the key phrase, because she's got a little pun going there. She's talking about the way in which the poem as a song needs to be heard, and the singer needs to be heard. And for the self to reach some level of, maybe I would say, happiness, sometimes it's redemption, the self needs to be heard out, and literally to be helped out of its circumstance by being listened to. And that's the pun that she's playing with there. She also is doing something that in free verse is quite dramatic, which is that she breaks her lines to create double meanings of lines, and especially of the word in the so-called rhyme position, the end of the line. So she does this here when she says, "It is terrible to survive, that unto itself is terrible," and then "it is terrible to survive," and she augments it as consciousness. So that increases the complexity of the idea. And then "it is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth." And there you see her Persephone. There you see the classical figure who's kept by Hades in the dark as his lover. This technique, by the way, in literary terms, is called enjambment, E-N-J-A-M-B, literally from "to throw a leg over," from the French, enjambment. And it has to do with squeezing meanings out of the form of the language. With sometimes people who don't know free verse might come to free verse and say, well, if I just chopped it up, that's a poem, right? And the answer is no. Actually, the lines themselves, they're not only brushstrokes, but they are also units of meaning that create a relationship between ideas. A line is an idea, and it exists in the context of other ideas. So enjambment lets her do that. The second key line that happens here is the return from oblivion to find a voice. And again, the poem here speaks to the Persephone figure reaching springtime, the flower that's blooming after winter, but also the self that's coming into bloom and the self that's finding its voice. The last three lines, "the center of my life came from the center of my life," is a reference, a specific reference to the opening of the Inferno of Dante. And to think, now that we have come to the center of our life, that great poem begins with the same phrase, depending upon who translates and how. My preference these days is the Pinsky, but she's referring to it there. I will also point out one more thing about this poem, which is also a concept that we're going to get to later, and that is, as a free verse poet, she nevertheless has a kind of default stanza that she likes. And her default stanza is the 3-line stanza, or the tercet. The tercet is Dante's stanza. Dante has interwoven tercets that become terza rima, that are rhymed in an interwoven pattern. But she returns to the 3-line stanza, to the tercet, especially in moments of drama. And so one of the questions people have reading a free verse poem is, well, what's the difference between the beginning and the end? Or how does the drama build? And you can see in Wild Iris that she begins with 2 couplets. There was a door and I remember, that are in a formal relationship to each other as kind of half lines in those 2 couplets. And then she starts her tercets, 3-line stanza, 3-line stanza. And then there are 2 5-line stanzas, and you could play with whether those are 2 plus 3, which I think arguably they are. A soul and unable, which to me connects again to the other shorter lines. And then she comes back to the 3-line stanza. So there's a formal, and I would even argue classical elegance to the work that is consistent with her thematic interests, with the Persephone, with the Dante, but also with the power of her emotion, always in search of a form. She's always in search of a form. And the form is for her, I think, through free verse, it is very much in the vessel of the poem having this kind of normative stanzaic pattern, even though we are in free verse. So that's a complex idea, this notion of her formal interests. But at the same time, I think really important to talk about. I'm now going to give you another poem, and I'm going to show you her. This is her reading. Again, I am loath to read for her. I have to get rid of the Wild Iris, which is sad, because I love that poem, and move to her reading here, and this screen share. And this is a poem, this is her poem called October. And it's a very long poem. It's like 6 or 7 pages. It begins Avernus. And I'll introduce it a little bit, then I'll share the poem, her reading, and again, I'll share the text with you and talk through a little bit how I'm reading it. So Avernus, first of all, Avernus is a real place. It is a crater lake. It's about 10 miles west of Naples. In Roman times, it was called Avernus and regarded by the Romans as the entrance to the underworld, which perfectly suits Glick's interests. For her, this entrance to the underworld allowed her to think through, among other subjects, 9/11. So she was in New York during 9/11, and she was wondering, or she spent a lot of time thinking about the way to process that event and her own experience in it, and also what it means for the artist to have experienced trauma, what it means for the artist to seek in herself an answer to trauma. She's not a political poet. And so what's key here is that she's not going to write about 9/11. And what she's not going to say, here is my book called September 11. In fact, she's going to write a long poem at the beginning of Avernus called October, and not announce that it's a 9/11 poem. She's processing through the personal, processing lots of really fascinating current and political ideas, and you'll see these in the poem. But she's not naming herself as more than a witness, and she's never a victim to a contemporary circumstance. It's not interesting to her. So here she is, and this is section 5 of October, the long opening poem that begins Avernus from 2006.
5. It is true there is not enough beauty in the world. It is also true that I am not competent to restore it. neither is there candor, and here I may be of some use. I am at work, though I am silent. The bland misery of the world bounds us on either side, an alley lined with trees. We are companions here, not speaking, each with his own thoughts. Behind the trees, iron gates of the private houses, the shuttered rooms somehow deserted, abandoned, as though it were the artist's duty to create hope. But out of what? What? The word itself false, a device to refute perception. At the intersection, ornamental lights of the season. I was young here, riding the subway with my small book, as though to defend myself against this same world. You are not alone, the poem said, in the dark tunnel. 6.
Here is the text for October. What I'd like to note about this poem in particular, you can start by seeing the same kind of argument, and this isn't just because of the poems that I chose, but the same kind of argument about her stanzaic work that I made regarding In the Wild Iris is also true here. Here are the tercets, the 3-line stanza, followed by a 2-line stanza that connects with perhaps the 3rd line following it, the bland, and then misery of the world looks like it could be a 3-line, it could connect to lined with trees, and then we are kind of overlaps between lined with trees, and we are companions here, not speaking. But notice how she's coming back to the 3-line stanza, back and back and back to the 3-line stanza, and then once again the poem ends with a tercet, with a 3-line stanza. So formally, we are again in familiar Glick territory. Now she has worked in longer lines, and each of her books since her 3rd book has been a book-length series, which is a really notable shift for a lyric poet to write long series. And sometimes the longer lines are longer lines because she's thinking about voices. Her most recent volume, for example, is in the voice of an aging gay male painter, something we find out late in the volume, but it takes a while, and that voice has longer lines. But she does throughout her career, and they're throughout all of the books, the 20 or so books, she does return to her Dante and to her tercet. So to my mind here, one of the key conversations has to do again with what we saw in Wild Iris, which is the artist's duty to create hope. And here she asks, the voice of the speaker asks, out of what and what? And what I have to say, what I particularly love about this poem, there are 2 moments I particularly love, but one is that second what, and the question of who actually says that second what. Because you could argue, you could see that it's the self is saying it twice for emphasis, but you could also hear the second what in this line as the world echoing back to us who we are. The world itself false. The echo is false, a device to refute perception. And that's a classic Glick move, where she's really, in marvelous ways, letting the language do so much work at such a level of nuance and sophistication so to me, this is again what makes her kind of easy. Out of what? Out of what? Out of what? What? The language is accessible. But then if you drill down into the repetition of this, the only word repeated in the poem, why is that word repeated? Who is saying it? Where is it coming from? what is the relationship between the self, and I see it kind of as the self dropping a stone into the water of the world, and it's a sounding, it's a testing of the world and its response to our own existence. And then she has this amazing moment at the end where she talks about the ornamental lights of the season. Nature is always there in a Glick poem, always present. Sometimes the built world is present, but the built world is for her often ornamental. It's a common response she has to what we do to nature, which is merely for her ornamental. I was young here. Notice the transition in time. Notice we are not when or where we were when the poem started. Again, that's the lyric poem in operation. And then the memory, the personal riding the subway with my small book as though to defend myself against the same world. And the same world is the world that the poet speaker was in as a young person, as it is post 9/11. But then the redemption, and redemption is not easy for Glick. The poems can be very bitter and very difficult to manage emotionally, but redemption is possible in this one. And then the poem, "You Are Not Alone," the poem said in the dark tunnel. And notice the power of the poem in the life of this speaker. The poem is what offers us solace. The poem is what comforts us. The poem is the only answer that this person has to the same world, to the world of 9/11, to trauma that exists in one's childhood, defending oneself against it, to the echo of who am I, the world merely being an echo to that question. The poem is the answer for her. And it's really a very powerful, I find, a very powerful discussion of the artistic dilemma and the way in which art does offer some remedy, some help and hope for us. So the poem goes pretty deep and is filled with also, I would say, a kind of bitter acceptance of the conditions of human existence, as well as trying to wrestle with them, trying to see where in the self some redemption might be found. It's got the trip into the underworld, not to be underestimated. Sorry about the pun, but there's your subway into the underworld. She's often, her figures move in and out of these various states, but also underground, again into the gates of hell, and again back out again. And the gates of hell are prominent. Hell itself is a prominent image in her work. So these are the two poems that I have on my agenda. I want to talk very quickly about the critical reception she has received, because I hate it, and because I think it's also worth noting that when she was awarded the prize, social media, of which I am both obsessive and reluctant and enthusiastic participant, in which I participate, that there was a fair bit of blowback to her receiving the prize, because, as is the case, she is actually sometimes a fierce person. And that fierce person there were comments made such as, maybe it could have gone to a nicer person. Of course, it's deeply misogynistic. Of course, it has to do with the ways in which the reception for her poems has sometimes been personal and attacked by male critics. And I just want to share with you quickly two little moments of that. This is actually an essay from the literary website Hyperallergenic, and by the critic by the critic Barry Schwabsky. And I'm gonna just share the screen and read through and show you the kind of reception sometimes that women poets in America receive for either writing or not writing a certain kind of poem. And Schwabsky writes, Glick's poems are written in the first person and cycle through a limited repertoire of places, nouns, and themes, including the real names of her ex-husband and son. And so it's hard to understand, I'm sorry, that's my typo, the poet's work is in something, that the poet's work is in something other than a confessional mode. Glick writes, quote, "When I speak passionately, that's when I'm least to be trusted, but to confess to being an unreliable narrator is still a confession, and her use of mythical figures might work less to universalize these personal issues than to aggrandize them." Shravsky somehow believes that the limited repertoire, that the real names are going to signal and signify that she's deep in the self as a confessional writer, and he doesn't understand that that's not who she is and what she's interested in. And then he has this horrific ending to his essay, until someone can explain it to me how the language is actually being reworked. I'm just not ready to start tackling, and that's tackling this big book of hers, the one that I talked about earlier. So yeah, maybe there's a little sexism here. Yeah, maybe. And maybe that sexism drifts into other places and other ways. And so I'm going to share now. This is an essay, excerpts from an essay that you can buy on the internet. And it's from a student's essay about Glick. And I will keep it unnamed. Just to make sure, can you see this? I'm still sharing the same thing. Can someone tell me?
Yes.
Thanks. This self-hatred and offensive nature can be found throughout many of Glick's poems. It is clear that Glick feels revolted by her own bondage of her body to the physical world. And then quoting from one of the poems, the pulsing crotch can be seen as sexual arousal, either willing or unwilling. The speaker may look like a woman. However, she does not bear the same fruits or desires of union that normal women wish for. She does not find wholeness through her submission to a man, as implied by the expectations she faces. And then here's Wikipedia helping this student. The Freudian theory of her art being a close study of the female vulva first emerged 100 years ago, but even in 1993, Glick uses this idea to form her own artwork in her poetry. So I have not received this essay from a student at Davidson. I would not look forward to receiving this essay from a student at Davidson, and you Davidson alums, of course, would never buy an essay on the internet. So we're probably in the clear. But this is just to indicate in part the ways in which, how important it is that she's won the Nobel Prize. To be a woman writing poems in this country, to win a prize that's much contested, that 2 years ago canceled on account of a sex scandal. Last year went to Olga Tokarczuk from Poland, and this year to a poet who's in some way a kind of pure poet, whose interest in the self has a universality rooted in classical learning, in the play and depth of ideas found in the language, and who offers to us, I think, an object lesson in an artistic vision that's both eccentric and also universal. So I'm a fan, and I'm happy to talk about that. We're going to move to, in fact, this Q&A. I have talked on plenty, and I want to say a couple things about the Q&A. And one is that we have swag. Right. So for those of you who have managed to endure all of my rambles and want to ask a question, you ask a question, put it in the chat, ask it of Suzanne Churchill. Again, direct your question to Suzanne Churchill, and that we are going to give away 10 of these books. So we're going to ask you to ask your question. It'll be asked. We'll do a Q&A for a while. And then we're going to keep track of the questions and who asked. And we have 10 books to send, courtesy of Dace and Sherry Nelson's office, very generously, and we're going to go from there. So I do have, while you're perhaps thinking of a question, I might be posting it in the chat. I have one more little clip to show you, which is a very short clip, and here it is. So again, this is Louise Glick. And again, I would welcome your questions and the conversation. I'm going to share the screen. share the screen. And this is from an interview. And here she is. And thank you for your time and attention.
I feel alive when I'm doing it and much less alive when I'm not doing it. I write to discover meaning. I want experience to mean something. It's less a matter of who I am than that idea that nothing should be wasted. There's something must come of it. And writing is a kind of revenge against circumstance too. Bad luck, loss, pain. If you make something out of it, then you've no longer been bested by these events.
So thank you, folks. And I look forward to questions, and perhaps I can answer some of them, and appreciate your time.
Okay, some questions have already come in. Before I start them, Chris Martin has a comment that research by psychologist Todd Thrash shows that good poems cause tingles. So I imagine everybody in this Zoom room is tingling right now after hearing Louise Glick's poems. So the first question actually comes from Jennifer Knox, asking how to distinguish the personal from the confessional. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that when the poet defaults to autobiographical experience as the meaning of an event, when the learning is found in what the writer has lived, as opposed to what the writer is processing, and so commentary is made that I'm still talking. So for example, if I'm writing as say a famous confessional poet did about my father, and I end up judging my father and judging myself and judging the relationship in some way and calling him bastard, which has happened in a famous confessional poem, but I'm still trying to make meaning of the lived experience. And that to me is confessional and autobiographical. It's using the stuff of the self to out my emotions. The personal to me is using this, is more syncretic, it's more synthetic. It's taking personal and lived experience, combining it with perhaps retrospection and insight, but it doesn't default. The meaning is not found in the experience itself. The meaning is not used to judge the lives of myself or the people around me. The meaning is found in something that reaches beyond what only I experienced as the writer. And I'm actually looking for what you experienced in your lives. So I'm not talking about me all the time in a way that in the worst confessional poems is solipsistic, only about itself. And the best poems is revelatory, but I'm talking about me and you and using my personal experience to get to it. The stuff of my life is the data of the poem. I was the poet with the book on the subway, but I'm looking for meaning that's greater than that data. And so that's how I would distinguish between the confessional and the personal.
Okay, the next question comes from Lily Rothman. Glick's poetry is very much in conversation with philosophy, but unlike philosophy, a male-dominated discipline, her language is very simple. Is this itself an act of feminism, a rejection of verbose mansplaining?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Professor Dr. Rothman. Yes. Thank you for your question. And very clearly, the gendering of the diction is also an aspect that she's quite conscious of. She really wants you not to be attracted to the plumage. She's not trying to distract you with the brilliance of her diction in a way that I think we can see in a number of male poets. Not all. I mean, this is not, I'm a guy, I write poems. I sometimes like to show my feathers when I'm writing my poems, and sometimes I don't. But I think for her, it's very much consistent with her feminism and thinking through it. And I think you're right with a history in philosophy of getting at the ideas rather than parading her own, in this case, feminism or femininity.
A couple of people want to know, but the first to ask was Colin Rafferty. For folks new to Louise Glick, where to start? Is there a specific volume? Should we go chronologically? What's your advice?
I would start maybe with the Triumph of Achilles, which is an early book. I would definitely go to the two garden books, Meadowlands and The Wild Iris, and I would also read Avernus. So those are those four books are my touchstones in her corpus. So again, I would go through and I would say the Triumph of Achilles, which was, I think, might have been the first book-length series. Descending Figure, her second book is great, but by the third book, she's really into her mature work where she is writing these book-length series. So Triumph of Achilles to me was the first book where that's the breakthrough book, I believe. And then the two most prominent books of the middle period are The Wild Iris and Meadowlands. And Meadowlands actually has a football poem about the Giants. I'm a Giants fan. It's perhaps the least of her poems ever, but she is thinking about how the Giants could have chosen, how the Giants from classical mythology chose Meadowlands for the name of their stadium. So just to let you know, she's not without humor. And then I would read Avernus. Avernus, I think, is a masterpiece. And that's, again, from 2006.
Someone named Graham Merriman wants to know, can you talk more about why you think Louise Glick might think of a poem as a telephone?
She talks about this herself really well in interviews. And in fact, she's really not interested in enlarging the audience for poetry. She is much more interested in making the poem, the experience of the poem between herself and an individual reader. And so one of the questions that she got about politics in wake of writing Avernus was, is this a work of political poetry? And she said, no, this is a book of poems that's between me and you. And to think that it's going to get a wider audience based on subject matter is to diminish what I'm trying to do. She doesn't want the wide audience to have access to them through the moment to the work. Her gaze is set on the ages, I would say. And those are her ambitions. And she believes that happens between the poet, the poem, and a reader. And so that's why, for me, it would be a telephone. I think, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, I misspoke. The Schwabsky is not in hyperallergenic, it's in hyperallergic. Is that right? Hyperallergic. I think I misspoke, by the way. So
we have a couple of questions, people interested in you positioning Glick in relation to other poets. Cheryl Aikman asks about another poet who has a remarkable ability to describe the natural world, Maxine Cumin. And Adrian Kafapoulou is wondering if if Glick is an outlier in the American poetry canon, that her poetry, often resonant with the ancients and their parable-like allusions to myths and her interest in the liminal. So could you talk a little bit for these listeners about what her place in the American poetry canon is and who?
Yeah, Maxine Cumin's a great call, and that's a really interesting poet to put her next to, in part because Maxine Cumin is such a also a learned poet, very interested in the classics, but also a formal poet, very kind of relentlessly formal. And for Max, what interested her was the way in which the poems in received forms, classical forms, rhyme and meter, had a power that she could put in dialogue with her own feminism. And she felt it was a little bit like if you're going to be a lawyer and you want to change the system, do you work from the inside or do you work from the outside? Like, do you sue everybody? No, wait, don't do that. You're going to lose in Pennsylvania. Or do you work within the system to change the system? And I think in that way, Adrian's question is probably right. That Glick is working outside of the system as a free verse poet who's not writing confessional verse, whose classicism is, and her interest in this midrash tradition, the question and answer between the self, these are unique to her. And that combination just, I think, is always what you look for when you think about a poet or an artist who's inimitable. I don't know anyone else writing like Louise Glick. Whereas I would say, not to in any way diminish Maxine Cuman's accomplishment, but I do know other poets who are writing in form, who are working within the system to make change, and some of it is as working as women writers within a male culture, within the patriarchy.
Okay, we've got so many good questions coming in. One person, Jane, wants to know, from the allegations of the critic quoted and from her response to the question of why she writes, how important is it to know about her biography for a fuller engagement with her poetry versus a more universal approach?
Yeah, so this is always a question, because the biography informs the reading of the work. If the biography justifies your interpretation of a poem, I think you're going too far. So that, can I tell you how to stop going too far? I can't. If you write a paper for me, I can show you where you went too far. And which I think, actually, if that's the Jane I think it is, she probably did write a paper for me. But the biography is useful in part because it helps us contextualize the lived life in relationship to the imagination. I don't test a writer's work by their biography, and I don't explain a writer's work with their biography. Her insistence that she's not really interested, it's not about me. That to me is, and that's one reason I use that clip. That's the personal. That's her saying, I'm here as a test subject for greater ideas. And it's my life that I'm using at times, but it's the greater ideas that interest me.
Here's a somewhat related question about how to read poetry. Porter Halliburton asks, which is the more powerful poem, the one whose meaning is immediately clear and innate, or one that requires the sort of study needed to mine the meaning from Glick?
Can I say yes? That it's one or the other? Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. To me, it's the poem that stays with you. It's the poem that outlives its reading. It's the poem that lives in you. And it's the poem that you want to type it up and carry it with you. And in fact, let's answer that question with a poll. It's a horse race, people. Just saying. I think we're in the home stretch here. I'll give you 10 more seconds to vote. I guess what I'm hoping is that the results of the poll are a little bit about what we've been able to talk about tonight. And the two poems that we encountered, especially, these are not my closing remarks. I think there are more questions to come, but I think kind of interesting that her spiciness, that's more ginger than garlic, that carried with me should be a poem that carries with me. I carry it with me. And notice it's for when the lights turn red. It's for a moment of reflection as well as a pause in the dailiness, and makes me important. It's a real answer. I think that, you know, reading a poem that makes me important is one of the reasons you read a poem. It's not an act of vanity necessarily. It's an act of validation. And then doesn't belong, and that's good, would be part of the argument that I've made tonight. Part of my answer to Adrian's question about Glick and her idiosyncratic and peculiar genius, to use the word genius in the 19th century way, that this is her eccentricity, this is her individual vision. It doesn't belong. And I think that's what, in fact, the prize committee was saying when they gave her the prize. They were acknowledging the individual genius of this vision. So I like your results. I commend you.
Here's a question from Mari Carpanetti, all one word, which appeals to me as an aging professor. She writes, in her interview with the New York Times after she won the Nobel Prize, Glick mentions aging as being an uncomfortable experience, but also invaluable from an artistic standpoint. Do you find this frankness reflected in her poems, and if so, in any particular?
Yes, very much in her poems. And in fact, there's a poem I think it's even in the current New Yorker, there's a poem of hers that in part engages aging. She's never been one to shy away from the body, and she's never been one to back off the body as a site for her own metaphysical and spiritual and psychoanalytic investigations. So I think she's going to be in many ways an even greater poet of older age. I think that awaits her, and I'm looking forward to it. There are not very many great poets of older age, because the lyric itself tends to be a poem that's, I mean, Frost in his 40s, Wordsworth stopped by the age of 40. You could argue Bishop. I think that Suzanne might have a way to talk about Bishop and the power of the early lyricism versus the song form not necessarily being what the older poets default to. The one exception for me in my reading might be Yeats, who is a great, powerful poet of middle and older age. Yeats of the Tower, for example, is a great poet of aging. And I think Glick has that. I think it's there. I think she could do this. I think because the body has been this site of her, of so much dynamism for her, I think it's possible.
Ben Caldwell asks, do you think Glick's incorporation of classical mythological archetypes aims toward a certain reader? Do you imagine she has an intended reader?
I don't think she's a poet who believes that poetry is sold in the supermarket and read by people who won't know her allusions. I think there's some elitism going on. But at the same time, I think that's in the art form, in the traditions of the art form. And I think that she just assumes she's not going to suffer fools. And for her, that means you got to know what she's talking about. I think that's also part of her reputation as a person and why people wanted her to be nicer when she got the Nobel Prize. I think she thinks you should go look it up if you don't know. And as perhaps an English professor, I might share that feeling.
A number of people, and I think we're already past 10, so I'm not going to try to find all the questions, but a number of people wanted to know more about her relationship to Dante. One question that I'm trying to find again said, what does her use of an engagement with Dante have to do with the more personal side of the poems? And Thomas Waddell wants to know about Terza Rima and her resistance to use it and choice of free verse, says about her difference from Dante. So can you talk a little bit more about Dante and that relation, how it illuminates her work?
So I think Dante for her is the exemplar of the poet willing to go deep into the self and return. And deep in the self, as she reads him, is the personal journey into hell and out and back again. And I think she takes that as a I think in her work, that journey has a kind of psychoanalytic power, that she is journeying into a hell that's constructed of our illusions and delusions, and not the literal hell populated by her enemies, unless those enemies are self-esteem, anxiety, depression. So for her, the journey into the self, deep into the underground and back out again, is something that she keeps returning to Dante. And I think it's a really good analogy for thinking about her own artistic pursuit, that she has herself opened that gate and gone in and come out again. And she names it in Avernus, and she names it in other books as well. And I think it's consistent again with how beloved Persephone is. Persephone who gets to escape hell and come out, and then has to be brought back to hell. She's really interested in those, the travel between these states of being, these underworlds, and into and out of the self. So Dante is the prime example of that for her in her reading, and she's obsessed with him in a way that's, I think, been great for her work. As for Terza Rima, I don't know how to speak to a poet who decides to write in free verse versus deconstruct an existing stanzaic form and offer it expressively, one line to make a little bit more meaning, who resists the rhyme, except to say that perhaps it's not her bag, that we find our voices in form, and form also teaches us our voices. And I think that she's never been the poet who reverts to received anything, and a form is a terza rima is a received form.
So Ellen's iPhone was struggling to get a question through, and it kept breaking up, but she's thinking about Glick in relation to Evan Boland and wants to hear about object lessons in Glick's poetry. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd actually need a little bit more clarification to know how to answer that question. How are objects lessons being thought of in Boland, and how are they being thought of in? Sorry about Ellen's iPhone, but I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. What do you think is being asked there? What?
I'm not sure. So, but there's another question from Katie Bennett that builds on it and opens up the question a little bit. Instead of just object lessons, she asks, as writers of poetry, what is the biggest lesson we can learn from Glick's work?
Oh yeah, so the swerve and the surprise, absolutely. That she is like this is a writer working in free verse in really easy language. And look what happens when she gives you that astonishing word of the azure seawater in a poem that has nothing to do with the kind of poeticism of language, and that suddenly at the end, from the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue shadows on azure seawater, and then like the stunning, astonishing move of introducing that adjective there, and how unforgettable, how that line will always be with me, at least because of the breathtaking color that is wrung out of the language. And I think she teaches you to surprise, to the swerve. She calls it a swerve. And she talks about, in teaching, she's always asking her students, where's the swerve? And I think what that teaches us is, don't be anybody else's artist. No, look for the inner, look for who you are and where you swerve. It's your eccentricity that we are looking for as readers. It's your swerve. I don't want you to write a Louise Glick poem. I want you to write a Katie Bennett poem.
Okay. Are we going till 9? Is that, am I?
Depends upon what you got on the queue. Whatever you, moderator. I yield to you because I can't see the questions. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to get, there are a bunch of questions and I'm trying to get the spirit of questions. There is a question from Felicia Van Bork, is pure poetry passé, that you might want to take? That's a wide open one. And then there are a number of questions that want to dig deeper back into some of the things you talked about, like line breaks in specific poems, but I'm not sure we have time to go back into the talk.
How about we say 10 minutes and then you'll figure out what we'll do another 10 and then. Can we do 10 or what do you want to do? I can't see the questions. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered most of the questions in terms of the spirit of questions. Some of them overlap.
Okay. So let me is pure poetry passé? Well, very nice alliteration, Felicia Van Bork. Nicely done. I like the ironist at work there in the framing of that question. I look forward to meeting you. Okay, so that's perhaps my wife. Is it passé? No, I don't think it's passé. What I do think is that poetry of the moment has, as many aspects of our lives have in this moment, has very immediate, acute concerns that need to be addressed to rehabilitate the culture beyond its toxicity. And sometimes the answer to that is the purest of poetry. Sometimes the answer to that is political poetry that says things. So there are lots of ways to understand what's current and what's not, and also to think about poetry and art more broadly as remedy, at times in its purest forms, at times in its most local and acute and contemporaneous forms, and what those different kinds of remedies, those different poems offer to various challenges that we face together.
Here's another question on what's current now from Don Carroll. How do you see Glick's impact on the current generation of younger American poets?
Well, I think it's pretty profound. And I think that we'll see it even, I think we'll see it even more so 10 years from now because of the prize. I think it's really going to matter. I think that the work has she's been a great teacher, a very important teacher for a long time. And she judged the Yale series of younger poets for about a decade, where she chose a book of a poet aged 40 or younger. And those were some really interesting books. And some of those poets have become better or good, really interesting. I think we're going to see more of the influence, and I think we're going to see more because I think the work's going to be studied. We haven't had a Nobel Prize winner coming out of this country, in literature since Toni Morrison. So this is now canonical in a way that was perhaps only literary before. So I look forward to what it'll mean. I do hope that the work is, I mean, there's a lot of scholarly writing about her work already. No, there's some scholarly writing about her work already. And I look forward to seeing that improve. I look forward to longer, deeper considerations of the work. And I see it as gaining influence. It can only help.
John Fry wants to hear what you have to say about Glick's work over the course of its body, over the life of the poet so far, how it changes its continuities, and how it might model how one shapes a writing life, as in what lessons can be gleaned from her body of work.
Well, that's probably an assessment I don't have the ability to offer. I've read a lot of the work and read it for tonight, also reread a lot of the work for tonight. I do know that there was a really important move at the third book where she suddenly decided that she was writing book-length series, that she was thinking of book projects, she was doing concept albums. She went from a hit song to Dark Side of the Moon. And I think that was a deep dive for her, a very risky dive. I also think that she models the ebb and flow of inspiration over the course of her career in a way that I find heroic, and how she talks about not writing, and how she talks about writing in the ways that when suddenly there's Mozart and begonias and she's able to pull herself out of a 2-year slump and generate a spectacular, maybe I think in some ways her best book. So I think there are lessons, and I think what we get from her is her perseverance, the relentlessness of her curiosity, and her willingness to see what's next. I don't really see that she's written the same book twice. And for all of the signature moves, the fact that I feel like I can identify a Louise Glick poem pretty readily, I don't think the books are the same. And that reinvention, I think, is also artistically and personally heroic.
Okay, I think that's pretty much our questions. Several are sort of repeats and overlaps, as I've said, but I'm gone back through them, and I think that you've done a marvelous job addressing and exciting people's interest and generating good questions, but also answering them. So,
well, great. Thank you, moderator Suzanne, for your delightful
thank you.
help. And I have to say, I remain fascinated between the background and the colors. That I'm very happy. And thanks again also to just as a shout out to Sherry and Bonnie for helping to make this work. Thrilled to be able to do it. And my hope is that we're reading Louise Glick, that we're moving forward, and that something tonight perhaps has tingled.